Everybody, I'm here today to take a look at the Conan the Adventurer action figure from the early 90s. Now this is based on the Conan the Adventurer cartoon series that came out at the same time, that was kind of trying to be a new Master of the Universe for the 90s with these big buff action figures and the cartoon series, but it didn't really catch on. Now these figures were made by Hasbro, surprisingly, even though they don't really look like your traditional Hasbro action figure. They're pretty big, they're about 7 inches tall, which at the time seemed huge. By today's standards, that's about the same size as an adult collectible action figure. But they're nowhere near the same sort of quality. Pretty minimal articulation really, just at the hips there and at the shoulders. Though he does have some articulation in his elbows that fold inwards, which is an articulation point that I kind of hate when they go inwards like that. It's very difficult to get a decent pose when the arms go inwards rather than folding forwards. But for some reason they've given him that articulation point. Otherwise it is just your standard at the legs and the shoulders, no neck articulation. It comes with 2 weapons, a battle axe, which has got some really nice detailing on it, all these cracks and things and chips on the blade edge there. Quite a long axe and a little kind of strap for his wrist, even though it doesn't really go over his wrist. It's still a nice detail that's been added on there. And then we have his sword. Now the sword, funnily enough, seems to be based more on the movie designed sword than the cartoon series, which is strange. Maybe there were some changes in production during the making of the cartoon, but after the toy had already been sculpted and produced. See, it's got writing there and some rope around the handle, cast in gold, the same as the axe. They're pretty nice weapons really, even though they're a solid colour. They have a decent enough amount of sculpting detail to make up for the lack of paint apps. And lastly, he comes with Needle, which is this kind of juvenile phoenix in the cartoon. He was basically the Orko to Conan's He-Man. You know, every barbarian character needed a comedy sidekick. Lino had Snarf, He-Man had Orko, and Conan had Needle, the phoenix, who would kind of come out of his shield. Though the toy doesn't come with the shield, which is strange, because I think he used the shield more than the axe in the cartoon, so it made more sense for him to have an axe, have a shield, sorry, with Needle printed on the front, because Needle would kind of come out of the shield. That's not a bad sculpt either, really. There's quite a lot of detailing to the feathers there, you can see. So for the time, these were pretty good sculpts, really. It's the actual Conan figure that lets the side down, as I'll show you in a minute. But yeah, I do like the feathering detail on this guy. Now Conan does have an action feature on his back here. He's got this ring just kind of awkwardly sticking out of his back, but if you pull that back, it gives him kind of this chopping action, which tends to just chuck his weapons out of his hand because they don't fit in there that tightly. Let's try it with the axe. Because the axe is heavier, it kind of slows down the motion. But you get the idea with that. Now for the sculpt, he has got quite a cartoon look about him. They kind of capture that cartoony look in the toy, which is quite good really, though arguably you could say it makes the toy look a bit cheap. He's very buff, almost out of proportion. And I always, when I was a kid, thought these figures looked a bit cheap, but I kind of appreciate them a bit more now than I did back then. This is the very stereotypical Conan look, where he's just got his furry pants and boots on. He's got this gold necklace with the kind of bones, very much like he wore in Conan the Destroyer, the movie. Then on one wrist there he has kind of brown bandages around there, and on the other side a gold bracelet. He has another ring sculpted on there, but it's not painted, which really should be gold, a kind of gold band just under his shoulder there, between his bicep and his shoulder. A lot of veins and things sculpted in. I don't think this muscular buck looks as good as the Master of the Universe bucks did, that looked quite in proportion. Even though they were very large and exaggerated, it still looked in proportion. There were kind of a good scaling to those figures, whereas with this one, he just looks a bit out of proportion with the buffness of him and the sculpting. It doesn't look as realistic, really, even though I'm pretty sure they were trying to go for that Master of the Universe kind of big, bulky action figure design. He's got a lot of muscular sculpted in there. Got the furry pants there with kind of a snake logo, it looks like, on the belt, which is strange because the snakes were his enemies, not him. On the back, you've got that loop sticking out for the action features, long black hair. And then as we go down to the bottom there, he's got his He-Man boots on, kind of red. These would look better if they were brown, in my opinion, but they're kind of a bright red, the fur around the top and bandages around the middle, very much like the Master of the Universe boots, but also like the boots that Conan wore in the comics and in the movies. But for a cartoon version of Conan, this figure actually does look quite good. And just to compare him with a modern action figure, here's a 7-inch Conan that came out recently from Super 7, and you see they're about the same size, so they kind of scale well together, even though the 1992 figure is not as in proportion with the overly buff, huge body. And here he is with a couple of villains from the line, Rathamon and Skulker. Now Rathamon is basically the cartoon version of Tothamon, which is a villain from the comics, and Skulker is basically the cartoon version of Thulsa Doom from the comics. Not to be confused with Thulsa Doom from the movie, who was portrayed more like Tothamon from the comics. And then Tothamon in the movies wasn't portrayed like anyone from the comics, so it's kind of a mess of characters if you go by the movies that most people know them by. But in the comics, Tothamon was the guy who worshipped the snake gods and could kind of morph into a snake, and Thulsa Doom was actually the guy with a skull face. And you can see where Master of the Universe was influenced by this with Skeletor and King Hiss. There's Rathamon up close, the main villain. Now in the cartoon, most of the time he had more of a regular skin colour to his face and his arms, and then the armour was green, a bit like Serpentor from G.I. Joe, but for the toy they've made him all green. He also had a cape in the cartoon, which the toy doesn't have. So I don't think the toy really captures how cool the cartoon look was, actually. This is probably the weaker of these three. Now, like Conan, he has this action feature with the hoop on his back. You pull that back and he just kind of wriggles from side to side, doing an attack. You can see on that side he's got his Wolverine claw. Same articulation as Conan, just the shoulders and the hips, but no articulation in the middle of his arms there, which is a shame, really. It's quite a nice sculpt though. They did put a lot of detailing into these figures with all the scales on the snake armour. Certainly not a bad figure sculpt wise, even though the articulation lets him down somewhat. And now Skulker. I do love how vibrant the villains are. Really vibrant colours with the bright green of Rathamon. Then with Skulker here we've got the blue and the purple and the pinks. Very sort of early 90s neon look to them. But this is my favourite of the three. I think he's the most kind of in proportion body-wise, and he's got a great sculpt on the face there, that skull. I've just got a thing for characters with skull heads, I think, in general. But he's got this kind of Viking helmet with the purple horns on there. Lots of detail in this lizard thing on the helmet, which really I think would have looked better if it was green, since it seems as if it's supposed to be some kind of lizard. Now this guy, his arms actually have articulation that goes out to the side like that, like a modern action figure's shoulders, really. So he's got a good range of motion in his arms there, even though he doesn't have the articulation at the elbows like Conan did. It's quite nice that he has that, and that's because of his action feature. He has the ring on his back. With this one, you pull the drawstring out, but then you hook it onto this little skull here that pops out, and that stops it from getting caught up in him, because once you let it go, it kind of spin rounds in this crazy attack, which is actually pretty cool. try him on Conan. And you can see why the hoop is supposed to hook onto that, because if not, it gets caught up all over the place. I've had it get caught up in his waist before. This time it's gotten caught up around his arm, because it does come off of that hook quite easily when he's spinning round, and it ends up getting all knotted up. There we go. So I think his action feature is probably the more fun of the three, and I love the colours of this guy. Even though it's not very barbarian-like to be like bright pink and purple and blue, it's just a nice little colour scheme. He's got the skull on his chest, a bit like Rathamon has this snake design on his chest, the snake face. There's some really nice detailing on him as well, the skull motif. Paint-wise, these parts of his arm should be white, because that's exposed bone. But they've just kind of lazily done it all purple. But in the cartoon, that should be white, where it's bone. Then he's got these nice kind of skull boots. His design isn't that much different to Rathamon's. He's got kind of skull faces on his knees and feet, just like Rathamon has snake faces on his knees and feet. And then a skull face and a snake face on their chests, horns on their head. So on the one hand it's a bit repetitive, but on the other it makes them look kind of uniformed almost, so they sort of work well together. I think in the cartoon Skulker actually worked for Rathamon. And the one accessory I don't have for Conan is the figure stand that came with him. All the figures in this line came with a figure stand, and that's because they can be a bit difficult to stand up, especially when they're holding their weapons with their arms out in front of them. Conan in particular, because he's in this kind of action stance that a lot of figures in the 90s started to do, rather than just being in a neutral pose. You can see with one leg kind of leaning forward in front of the other. That does give him balance issues, and that was always a problem with action figures of the time, because they were in that specific pose, trying to look like they were lunging into action. That would make them often be off balance and fall forward or backwards, and it was a real pain in the backside. And Conan here does suffer with that, especially when he's got his weapons in his hands. So on the one hand, it's good that the toy makers put figure stands in with these toys, but on the other hand, that's kind of admitting that you've designed a toy that isn't good enough to stand up on its own. And I think a toy being able to balance is pretty standard kind of quality that most people are going to want in an action figure. Thanks everyone for joining me in this look at Conan the Adventurer, and I'll catch you again soon.